ground-floor flat on a quiet residential street in Arthur's Hill, Newcastle upon Tyne. A Saturday afternoon in August 2008. The kind of neighborhood where people know each other well enough to notice when something feels wrong. What felt wrong that afternoon was the silence. Friends of the couple who lived there had been calling, no answer. They had tried the door, they knocked again. Eventually, they let themselves in. What they found inside that flat changed everything. Two people, both 25 years old, both bound, both dead. The flat showed signs of a struggle that had gone on for some time. One of them, a young woman, had a cloth stuffed into her mouth. The other, her boyfriend, had wounds to his neck and injuries across his body that told investigators he had been subjected to sustained and deliberate harm before he died. Detectives from Scotland Yard's Specialist Chinese Crime Unit were on a train to Newcastle by nightfall. Officers from Northumbria Police had already boarded a flight to Beijing. The first theory was organised crime, an international syndicate, a contract killing ordered from thousands of miles away. The truth, when it finally came, was both simpler and stranger than anyone had imagined. It came down to a man nobody had looked twice at, a man who had been hiding in plain sight in the same building from the very beginning. This is the story of Zhou, Zhen Xing Yang, and the man who killed them both. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Victim biography. Zhou was 25 years old. She had grown up in Hunan province in China and had come to England to study, enrolling at Newcastle University, where she completed a master's degree. She graduated in September 2006, alongside the man who had become her boyfriend, Zhen Xing Yang. After graduation, she stayed. She found work as a waitress at a noodle restaurant in the city, and she and Yang made a life together in Newcastle. Colleagues at the restaurant described her as hard-working and full of energy. She was remembered as someone with a warm, bubbly personality, the kind of person who made a room feel lighter. She had been in the United Kingdom for just over 3 years at the time of her death. Zhen Xing Yang was also 25. He was from Dalian in northeast China and had been in England for 5 years by the time the couple were found. He and Zhou had met at Newcastle University during their studies, and the two had been together since. Friends knew him as Kevin. The picture that emerged of them in the days after their bodies were found was of two young people at the start of adult life, educated, with degrees behind them, trying to build something in a city that was far from home. Zhou was working, Yang had other plans, some of which, it would later become clear, were considerably more complicated. But before any of that complexity is addressed, it is worth pausing on what those who knew them actually said. They spoke of a young woman who was cheerful and diligent, a couple who had found each other far from home and built a life in a city neither of them had grown up in, two people who were 25 years old, and who had every reason to believe they had a great deal of time still ahead of them. Newcastle, in 2008, had a substantial Chinese student population. The university drew postgraduate students from across China, and many stayed on after graduating, finding work in the city's restaurants, shops, and businesses. Zhou and Yang were part of that community. They were not isolated. They had friends who cared enough to come looking when the calls went unanswered. They had colleagues who noticed when someone did not turn up for a shift. They had a life that people around them were aware of and invested in. That is the backdrop against which the 9th of August must be understood. Not a cold case about strangers found in an anonymous location, but two young people, known to their community, whose disappearance from it was noticed, and quickly. Offender biography and the relationship. Guang Hui Cao was 31 years old. He had come to Britain in 2001, initially on a student visa. When that visa expired, he stayed. He moved from job to job in the hospitality industry, working in restaurant kitchens across the north of England for low wages, living in accommodation that came and went with the work. By 2008, he was in Newcastle. To anyone who encountered him in those years, there was very little to distinguish him. He was a Chinese national, working in a Chinese restaurant, one of many such workers in cities across the United Kingdom, largely invisible to the broader population around him. He had no significant criminal record in the United Kingdom. He was not known to Northumbria police before the 9th of August 2008. What connected him to Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang was not immediately obvious, and that was precisely the point. Cao had made himself known to the couple by presenting himself as a prospective lodger, someone looking for a room in their flat. It was a cover story, a way in. He was not looking for somewhere to live, he was looking for something else entirely. What he wanted was money. Specifically, money he believed the couple had accumulated through their involvement in a football betting operation, an operation that had been running for some time, and which had made enemies along the way. The connection between Zhou and the couple's financial world was not one of close friendship or long association. It was transactional, instrumental. He had identified them or been pointed toward them as people who had money and who might be persuaded, under sufficient pressure, to give it up. He gained access to their home by presenting himself as someone with a legitimate reason to be there. By the time anyone understood what he had actually come for, it was too late. It is worth noting that the communities within which Zhou moved, and within which Zhou and Yang also lived, were relatively closed ones. Chinese nationals working in hospitality in Newcastle largely socialized within their own networks. Information about who had money, who was involved in what kind of business, and who might be approached moved through those networks quickly and informally. Cao had not stumbled on the couple by chance. He had found them through a world they all shared and had chosen, deliberately, how to use that access. Escalation. To understand why Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang became targets, it is necessary to understand the operation that Yang had been involved in, because it is the thread that leads directly to the 9th of August. Zhen Xing Yang had been working as an agent for an international football betting syndicate based in China. The operation exploited a very specific technical gap. When Premier League matches were broadcast in China, there was a delay of up to a minute between the live action in England and the footage appearing on screens in China. A person with real-time information from a match in England, relayed instantly to contacts in China, could place bets on outcomes that were already decided, before those bets were even registered on the Chinese end. Yang was that person in England. He watched matches, gathered live information, and transmitted it via the internet to gambling contacts in China, contacts who used the advantage to bet profitably. It was a form of deception operating at the intersection of technology and sport, and it was generating significant income. Over the 3 years leading up to their deaths, $356,000 had passed through the couple's bank accounts. Yang had also been providing fraudulent documentation to Chinese nationals in the United Kingdom, producing fake educational certificates and other official-looking papers for money. Both activities had created debts and grievances. There were people who believed Yang owed them money, or had failed to deliver what was paid for. On Chinese-language online forums, threats and accusations had been directed at the couple in the period before their deaths. The anger was real, documented, and traceable. When Northumbria police began investigating the murders, the sheer scale of the criminal network Yang had been operating within led them initially to suspect organised crime at the highest level. Scotland Yard's Serious Crime Directorate joined the inquiry, including officers who specialised in investigating activity by Chinese criminal networks. Detectives flew to Beijing. Every police force in England was asked to report any violent crimes with similarities to what had happened in Arthur's Hill. But the investigation would eventually narrow, not to a syndicate, not to a contract killing arranged from abroad, to one man in Newcastle who had decided to take matters into his own hands. On the 9th of August 2008, friends of Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang, who had been unable to reach the couple by phone, made their way to the ground floor flat at Arthur's Hill and let themselves inside. They found both Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang inside the flat. Both were bound. Both were dead. The flat showed clear evidence of a prolonged and violent confrontation. Investigators established that Yang had been subjected to sustained deliberate harm before his death. The evidence was consistent with someone being held and coerced over a period of time. His killer had wanted something from him and had applied considerable force in an effort to extract it. The most likely target was information about money, or the money itself, linked to the betting operation. He had wounds to his neck and had suffered extensive head injuries. He was eventually killed with a sharp-edged instrument. Zhou had a cloth forced into her mouth. She died from asphyxiation. Police initially speculated that this may have been done to prevent her from raising the alarm, while Yang was being interrogated in another part of the flat, or simultaneously. The murder weapons, described as a knife and a sharp-edged instrument, were never recovered from the scene. Detectives from Northumbria Police, examining the flat, the couple's phones and their computers, quickly began building a picture of the world Yang had been operating in. The forum posts, the threats, the money, the scale of the network. It all pointed outward, towards something large and international. Then the forensic trail pointed somewhere much closer. At the home of Guang Hui Cao, officers found trousers carrying bloodstains that matched the victims. They found personal belongings that had been in the flat. Phone data placed him in connection with the couple and with the location at the relevant time. CCTV evidence supported the timeline investigators were building. And crucially, the story he had used to gain entry to the couple's home, that he was a prospective lodger with a legitimate reason to be there, had given him access without raising any suspicion. Cao was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. Forensic and investigative evidence. The case built against Guang Hui Cao at Newcastle Crown Court rested on several distinct categories of evidence, each one addressing a different aspect of his presence, his access, and his guilt. The first and most directly incriminating was the physical evidence recovered from his home. The trousers found in his possession carried the blood of the victims. This was not trace evidence or a matter of proximity. It was a direct biological link between Zhou and the bodies of Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang, combined with the personal belongings of the victims also found at his address. The physical evidence established that he had been in contact with the victims and had taken items from their flat. The second category was mobile phone data. Investigators examined the call records and location data associated with Zhou's phone and were able to place him in connection with the couple and with Arthur's Hill in the period around the time of the killings. Phone data of this kind is significant in criminal proceedings because it does not depend on witness recollection or the reliability of a single account. It creates a time-stamped record of movement and communication that either fits the prosecution's timeline or it does not. The third category was CCTV. Newcastle city centre and the surrounding residential areas were covered by cameras, and footage recovered by Northumbria police was used to corroborate the timeline being built by investigators. Combined with the phone data, the CCTV evidence helped establish where Cao had been and when. The fourth element, perhaps the most revealing in terms of what it said about premeditation, was the manner in which Zhou had introduced himself to the couple in the first place. He had not forced his way in. He had not broken down the door. He had presented himself as a potential lodger, someone looking for a room, and had used that pretense to gain legitimate access to the property. This was not an impulsive act. It required a degree of planning and the deliberate construction of a false identity in relation to the victims. The investigation had initially looked outward, toward international criminal networks. The forensic and investigative trail, when followed carefully, led to one man who had made himself appear unremarkable. The jury at Newcastle Crown Court returned guilty verdicts on both counts of murder. As the verdicts were announced, Cao showed no visible reaction. Moments later, when a prosecutor rose to address the question of sentencing and stated that he would be seeking life imprisonment, Cao fainted in the dock. Psychological analysis. The first thing to observe is the nature of the planning involved. Cao did not arrive at the flat in Arthur's Hill by accident or on impulse. He had identified the couple as targets. He had constructed a cover story, the prospective lodger. That gave him a reason to be present without arousing suspicion. He had spent time in the flat, presumably assessing the situation, before returning to carry out what he came to do. None of this is consistent with unplanned violence. It speaks to a degree of forethought about access, timing, and concealment. The second element is the specific nature of what appears to have happened inside the flat. Yang was subjected to deliberate harm over what investigators believed was a sustained period. The evidence suggested coercion, an attempt to extract information, or a location of money, rather than immediate and fatal violence. This adds another dimension to the planning. Cao had anticipated needing time, and had prepared accordingly. The third element is what the case reveals about the vulnerability created by operating outside legal frameworks. Yang and Zhou had been involved in activities that generated significant income, but also significant enemies. They were not in a position to go to the police about threats made against them. They could not disclose the nature of their financial arrangements to seek protection. The online threats directed at them before their deaths were visible, documented, and largely unanswered, because the couple had no safe way to answer them through official channels. Cao was not the only person who was angry. He was simply the one who acted on it. This is not a mitigation of what he did. It is an observation about the particular kind of danger that accumulates when people are embedded in criminal economies and find themselves without access to the protections available to everyone else. The couple's vulnerability was, in part, a product of the world they had chosen to operate in. That made them easier to target and harder to protect. Most coverage of this case focused, understandably, on the violence, on the couple found bound in their flat, on the international network, on Scotland Yard and Beijing. But there is a detail at the heart of this case that has never received the attention it deserves, and it is worth stopping on it. The entire criminal enterprise that led to the deaths of Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang was built on 1 minute. Not a metaphorical minute, a literal one. The broadcast delay between a Premier League match being played in England and that same match appearing on television screens in China was, at the time, somewhere between several seconds and approximately 1 minute. That gap, invisible to most viewers, was the commercial foundation of an operation generating hundreds of thousands of dollars. Think about what that means. A goal is scored at a stadium in Manchester or Liverpool. People in the ground see it happen. People watching a live stream in England see it happen. 30 seconds later, or 50, or 60, the same goal appears on a screen in a flat in China, where someone has already placed a bet on it. The money is won before the image has even arrived. Yang was the mechanism that bridged that gap. He watched the match in England, he sent the information, and somewhere in China, that information was turned into profit. The entire structure depended on the speed of his transmission and the reliability of his network. This detail matters beyond the mechanics of the fraud, because it illuminates something broader about how the internet and global communications had, by 2008, created entirely new categories of financial crime, crimes that crossed jurisdictions in ways that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. The investigation that followed the murders stretched from a ground-floor flat in Arthur's Hill to offices in Beijing, and involved Northumbria Police, Scotland Yard's specialist units, and the Chinese embassy. The crime was local, the world it existed within was not. The minute of delay that made the betting operation possible also made Yang a target, because the money it generated attracted people who wanted a share of it and were willing to use violence to get one. A technical quirk of satellite broadcast scheduling ultimately cost 2 people their lives. In May 2009, Guang Hui Cao was sentenced at Newcastle Crown Court. He received 2 life sentences for the murders of Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang. The minimum term set by the judge before he could be considered for release by the parole board was 33 years. He had fainted in the dock when sentencing was raised. He left the courtroom having been told he would not be eligible to apply for parole until 2042 at the earliest, by which point he would be in his mid-60s. There were no lengthy victim impact statements read at the sentencing, no family members present to address him in court, because Zhou and Zhen Xing Yang's families were in China. The distances that had made it difficult for Northumbria Police to investigate the couple's backgrounds in the early stages of the inquiry were the same distances that kept their families from the courtroom on the day their killer was sentenced. Their parents learned of what had happened to them from thousands of miles away. They grieved from thousands of miles away, and they received what little justice a court in the north of England could deliver, from thousands of miles away. Zhou had worked in a noodle restaurant, and was remembered by her colleagues as bubbly and warm. She had come to England to study, and had stayed because she had built a life worth staying for. She was 25 years old. Zhen Xing Yang had been in England for 5 years. He had graduated with a master's degree, and had found a way, albeit a deeply flawed and ultimately fatal one, to use his position in England to generate income from a world he was connected to in China. He was 25 years old. Neither of them knew, when they opened the door to a man presenting himself as a potential lodger, that the decision to let him in would be among the last they ever made. If this case has raised questions for you about how criminal investigations cross international borders, or about the organizations that support victims of violent crime in the United Kingdom, links to relevant resources are in the description below. If you found this video useful, please subscribe and share it with someone who might want to understand how cases like this are built and prosecuted. The next case is already in production, and it is one you will not want to miss. Thank you for watching.